Welcome to another eCommerceaholic live stream. Hopefully, this time we are live. I put an awful lot of effort into trying to work out some technical difficulties. We did have some technical problems that we were dealing with, but maybe, just maybe, we've worked our way through those and we are live. Maybe I should hold just a little bit longer. It looked like when it came on live for me, you guys didn't see much of that intro. It's the new intro we've been using on our produced videos that we've put out last week. You're going to see a lot of changes and a lot of updates on this YouTube channel in the coming weeks. I don't know if you noticed, but we put out a video, including this one. We've put out a video every single day this week, and I'm going to try to continue that for 30 straight days. And it's just a matter of, we've got a lot of new equipment, a lot of new things we're trying to do. Creating videos is complicated, so let's just do something small and let's get them out. There may be focus problems, there may be technical glitches. Let's just get the content out. We'll get better with it. It'll get easier for us, and then we'll be able to roll in more complexity. So hopefully you've enjoyed those videos. If you've got any topics in particular you want me to cover, let me know. But we're here with another live stream. We're trying to get these back regular every single Friday at this exact same time. Again, we may experiment with some other times, but for now, let's just stick to the e-commerce happy hour Friday afternoons. I've got a great topic. Some of our most lively live streams have been about Magento hosting. And so we're going to have another live stream. If it's working, just keep going straight back to the well, right? There's no sense in reinventing the wheel. If this is what you guys want, we'll just keep talking about Magento hosting. Who am I to deny you what you're looking for? So got a great guest lined up today. We've got Jay Smith from WebScale. Jay, say hello to everybody out there in the eCommerceaholic universe.
Hey everybody, good to see you. Glad to be here and looking forward to a lively discussion with TJ.
Thanks, Jay, for being on. I'm trying to finish this bottle. I hate to even pronounce it on the live stream. People are going to give me a hard time about it, but it's like Bruichladdich. Maybe I got that right. Maybe I didn't. It's not my favorite thing in the entire world, but I'm trying to finish this bottle. You may know this is one of our swag items for Imagine. I ordered a ton of these. I'm glad I ordered a ton because 15% of them either didn't show up or were broken. But we've got the eCommerceaholic whiskey glass here. It's got my logo, the new logo on the front of it. If you want one of these, catch me at Imagine. I'll have some for you. If you're not going to be at Imagine or you don't want to have to fly it home, sign up for the newsletter. Should be a link in the description of this video. You sign up for that newsletter and we will start giving some away. We're going to give away little baskets of items. We've got some other cool things coming that we'll be able to give away. If you have questions, please post those in the chat. We've got a live chat for a reason. Post your questions. As soon as we can interject with those, we will do so, and we will get those questions answered. You guys always ask the best questions. I'm going to toss softballs. It's going to be easy. It's going to be just kind of a generic, high-level conversation unless you guys push us into the weeds, and I welcome you to do so. So please, post those questions. If you happen to be catching this after it's live, you can post them as comments on the video, and I will reach out to the WebScale team and get those questions answered. So we're going to start with my questions here. And, you know, the biggest thing I see with Magento hosting is it's almost always an afterthought. You sign up a merchant and they're like, we need a website, we need to make sales. Hosting is never, ever, ever in the conversation. And so many agencies out there try to do hosting themselves. Also, it's kind of an afterthought. They're like, we can make a few dollars. We committed very early to getting out of the hosting game because we realize the investment it takes to actually do it well. So, from WebScale's perspective, how should merchants approach hosting, especially maybe those that are a little uninitiated and uneducated? Like, how should they treat hosting rather than it just being an afterthought?
For sure. I think it has to be of prime concern. One thing that you find is that even, yeah, we see that a lot, right? So the customer has spent a lot of time to pick a good development partner. They invested a lot in that, creating that new website, but then ultimately they waited on the hosting. And you see a lot where the actual development partner that they chose will recommend an offering, and then that recommendation is what the customer tends to go with. What we like to see is certainly you're exactly right. It's extremely important. It's very complex, and it's hard to do it right. There are a lot of moving parts, especially these days, with the number of security threats that are out there in the world, and just the challenges in delivering good performance, regardless of where in the world you're hosting, or where your customer base is and who you're trying to deliver to.
Do you have any examples, perhaps, of merchants that maybe were neglecting hosting or not understanding the importance of it, and how setting up in the proper hosting environment maybe improve their metrics or transform their business?
Yeah, and actually, we see a lot of that related to cloud. So merchants, it's not uncommon for us to see merchants say, "Hey, we understand, AWS, GCP, they make it pretty simple, and we can just use their system and build something." And they kind of all look at each other at the end and say, "All right, well, who's going to get up in the middle of the night when something breaks?" And well, I'm not going to do it. And then they start looking for somebody to help them out. Even that, it's not uncommon for us these days. When we first started, we would see people in hardware contracts that were lengthy and static environments. And if a server went bad, that system would be down, and you'd be waiting for somebody to fix it, create a new system. It was long recovery times. People started to move to the cloud, and what they were doing early on is essentially just forklifting that static environment into the cloud. And so they weren't taking advantage of any of the dynamic nature of the cloud, and that really hamstrung them from a performance under heavy load and from a recovery situation, or even deploying new versions of their system. When you have this server hugger mindset of, I've got this old school, I have a hardware system, you have to think about deployment in place, or when I go do a new code deployment, I just have to do it on top of the production system. And that's a problem because there may be issues in the deployment that you haven't uncovered. Whereas from us, we're actually in the cloud, we just copy the production system, dry run the deployment, and make sure it's going to work long before you ever touch production.
So you touched on cloud hosting, and we try to keep this as I'll say uninitiated as possible, right? So we want to make sure we define things for those that maybe don't understand the vocabulary. I find that most merchants I deal with are, they're very smart, but they're not always educated on our lingo. And so let's, if you would, define cloud hosting, and then kind of how that relates to terms that merchants maybe hear a lot, like AWS.
Yeah, sure. So for us, we look at cloud hosting as it's what we do. We don't own any servers outright. So we are a software company that layers on top of public cloud offerings. And those public cloud offerings, predominantly we use AWS, Google, and Microsoft Azure. So in working with those public clouds, essentially what we've done is said, all right, the modern world, these guys are experts at building data centers. They're very good at provisioning hardware, ensuring that the diesel generator always has fuel in it. So if there's a power outage or something, they are excellent at running a data center and making that work well. And then what they're providing is what's known as infrastructure as a service. So they're giving us access to virtual machines running in that data center on specific networks that we can use to go provision our environments on top of. And so we do that through their APIs. They all have excellent authority models that allow us to authorize our software system into your cloud account, or in many cases these days, our customers are wanting us to take on the whole hosting and leverage our auto scaling for efficiency. And essentially, they get one fixed price, and then we we deliver everything under the sun for that price, and make sure that the system can survive any marketing event you throw at it. So I think that the key difference between essentially cloud hosting versus static or hardware-based environment is that in a hardware environment, you're actually leasing a machine, a physical piece of hardware in a rack someplace in the world, and you could go seek it out and find it somewhere. In this world, though, what we're doing is we're using our software to call APIs from that cloud provider to get virtual machines that we bring together into a functioning distributed system that's able to service your e-commerce application.
All right. We've got a question here. Again, I'm having some technical difficulties, as we always do. We had some issues beforehand where I made the mistake of sending the link to join this live stream for Jay to the entire WebScale team. So the entire WebScale team tried to join the live stream under one link. So I had to reboot this system to try to rectify some of that. So I can't pull up the questions. I've been really working on making sure all of those things worked, but I had to turn that on before we started the stream, and I'm not stopping it. We're not stopping this train now. Once we're rolling, we are rolling. So I'm just going to have to read your questions, but it's fine. Do you really need to see your questions? You're watching the chat. You can see them over there if you need to. We've got a question from Alan. Alan, thanks for watching, and I appreciate your question. And your question is, could we get a more detailed description of how the predictive auto-scaling works?
Yeah, sure. So in our world, being cloud hosted, we're firm believers in sort of the ephemeral nature of all servers. So we don't like to see any servers that live for a very long time, especially at the application tier. So our application servers are responsive to the environment that they live in. So we have a proxy that sits in front of the application. So all your HTTPS requests are coming to that proxy. The proxy is then routing them to the application cluster, and they're actually servicing the requests. Now, we also put in, there's logic in there, we call it web controls, that allow us to control the flow of traffic through that application cluster. Oftentimes you could say, well, you're asking for something that's off limits, or we're controlling who can access what within that production system, and then the proxy itself will return a reply to say, no, that's a 403 forbidden. You're not on the list of authorized users to go access that part of the system. So there's a bit of traffic control in there. One of the other pieces that system does is it monitors the application servers for their performance and availability. And so what we're looking at is, given the traffic that's coming through the proxy, how are the application servers responding? How healthy are they? And what do we have to do to keep the system running smoothly? So we can use, we basically are using that data about the health of those application servers to forecast the need for additional capacity, and then bringing that capacity online automatically behind that application cluster, or the proxies. So the proxies are actually collecting data about that application cluster, and then we're making control decisions on how to manage the cluster. So for example, if we see that the application servers are getting too busy, so the CPU load on the servers is going up, and we forecast we're going to have a problem in the near future, we're going to start creating additional application servers, and they'll get integrated into the cluster. That usually takes anywhere from 30 seconds to 5 minutes. It really depends on the number or the cloud provider that you're working in. Really, they're all very good. The ones that we pick for public cloud infrastructure, one of the reasons we pick them is that we get very consistent, reliable behavior that we can understand. From that standpoint, when we make that API call, we're not necessarily asking just for one server. We're understanding how under capacity are we, and how many servers we're going to need to bring online in the next time step to make sure that the system stays responsive in the environment that it's in. So we may go from 4 to 8 servers in one time step, 8 to 16 or more. That's really driven by the volume of traffic that's coming in. So in the triggering, there's a couple questions that I think I could keep with TJ around the same topic that are the auto scaling. It can be triggered on a variety of measures. We usually mix them. Typically, CPU is the big driver. PHP is fairly CPU intensive. It's an interpreted language. It wants lots of CPU to get its work done, especially for generation of dynamic content. Now, obviously, inserting a full page cache, using Redis or that can minimize the amount of work that has to be done. You're still executing PHP, but it's less. So it usually scale outs are triggered from a shortfall in CPU. Sometimes we see certain builds that are memory constrained and we're triggering on memory or load average if it's an IO issue in there as well. And then around reserved instances for our hosted customers, they're part of us. So we actually manage that. For our customers that run us in production in their cloud account, so they invite us into that cloud account to manage the system for them. Our clusters typically have a minimum, which is sort of what you need for your daily utilization. Those will be reserved instances, and then you would run reserved instances on the data tier as well.
Okay. I don't know if did we get to all the questions there? I was trying to pay attention to most of these.
Yeah, I was looking at that. It seems like we had the metrics that we could use for auto scaling. Yeah, so I mentioned that it's sort of CPU, load average, memory, either actual or forecasted, and then for duration. And then, and then around the reserved instances, I think there was some question around managing reserved instances.
Yeah. And that's what throws me off. See, I'm not a hosting infrastructure guy. So when you start throwing out RIs and things, I'm like, I got to read those very carefully. If we did not answer your question or you're not satisfied with those answers, please clarify, ask again. We will be happy to get to those. Looks like we've got. Go ahead. Continue.
Oh, TJ, an important thing to think about around when you're thinking about hosting, one of the advantages of being able to get a fixed price from us, so essentially a customer coming to us and saying, hey, I want you to be the hosting provider for us, that when they come to us with that, what that frees us up to do is to configure and manage auto scaling and the cost, all of the costs associated with that directly for the customer. So the customer is able to have this kind of hands-off experience where essentially they have this one price that they're going to get every month. They know it's going to deliver that. And then we're able to manage the system on the back end to deliver consistent performance at that price point for them. So it changes the mindset a little bit as opposed to focusing on how do I manage reserved instances in AWS, which can get very complicated, to just focusing on key drivers for your business, like the maintaining good performance for your website, maintaining availability and uptime, and not having to focus so much on the details of the infrastructure to achieve that. It's sort of leaving that to us to essentially say, you guys know how to do this, you do your job, and I'll measure you on performance and availability as opposed to, well, what was my AWS or GCP bill look like at the end of every month?
Gotcha. We've got a few other questions here from Eric. Eric, I appreciate you watching. It's been a while, man. I look forward to seeing you at Imagine. And we've got like I said, we'll go through your questions. If anybody has any questions, please keep them coming. We're here to answer your questions. While you're here as well, if you would, go ahead and give me a thumbs up on the video. If you're not subscribed, we're like 910 subscribers or so. At 1,000, we can actually do a few more cool things. I would really like to be able to do those cool things. So, if you're into Magento, if you're into e-commerce in general, why not hit the subscribe button? Tap the notification bell. If you're not really into that, then why the hell are you watching this live stream? I don't know, but welcome regardless. It's whatever you're into, it's okay. So let's see. We've got Eric asks, can customers choose their own instance types? Do you see better performance on GCP or AWS? And is one cheaper than the other? And which one do you have more customers on? It's a lot of questions, but they're all related. So
they are. They kind of all go together. Yeah, so customer instance types. Yes. What we tend to do is work with the customer. So in our provisioning process, we have an automated provisioning process that basically starts with your code, your data, and then we have an architecture that we signed up to deliver for you to meet your requirements for your application. So in doing that, what we tend to focus on at that point is we are going to do an extensive amount of testing, both us and you, functional load testing, making sure that scaling works, that the delivery is going to be excellent for you as the customer. We're going to also work with the developer closely in this. So there's three parties here, right? There's the merchant that owns the business. There's us delivering the hosting for that business, and then the development partner, who's a partner usually to both of us, to work with that developer to make sure that we're having a great user experience, functionally everything's working, and the performance is where we want to be. So by working together, we get there. And then part of that, I mean, your questions come to this, is sort of picking the instance type. We certainly have a recommendation as to what we've seen work for that version of Magento, that version of WooCommerce, et cetera, as to what's going to make that application go, or where we think we should start. And then from there, we're going to pick the best instance type for that. We have some customers that move millions of page views a day that use very, very large instances. Essentially, they're almost like big iron boxes that they need to scale with those, right? So some of the very largest instances you can get from Amazon in that case. And then we have others that don't need that. They can actually live in very small instance types. So what we tend to do then is essentially dial that in to meet your needs so that you get the best experience, both from the database and from the production web server that's in there. In terms of GCP and AWS, it's not so much that we see better performance in one versus the other. It's more that how fast we are to scale out in one versus the other, and then how how much the tailoring of the instance type is really your application requires. If it requires more specific, like there's a threshold in there if you need a lot of memory relative to the number of CPUs or what have you, there's a bit more flexibility on the GCP side versus AWS, but then AWS has a large number of sort of defined instances that actually work very well, and we have some good family of servers there that we pick both for the app server and the DB side. So, and then we actually have an equal number of customers in both between GCP and AWS. I mentioned Azure before. We have some customers there that's growing for us as a cloud provider. But I would say that the dominant number of customers for us is split between AWS and GCP. Around the cheaper comment, if you can get a very specific instance type, you can save money that way. There are differences in the billing models. So if you're owning your own cloud account, Google structures the cloud account to where you can get discounts based on sustained use for a month, and it's just baked into it. Whereas so it allows you a bit more flexibility. You're not sort of committing for a long-term architecture. You could make changes on a month-to-month basis there. And if that flexibility is important to you in the ongoing, say, maybe you're a new site and you're growing and traffic, the dimensions of traffic are changing substantially from month to month, that may be a benefit or a win there. To that end, you can get to the same level of the same price level at AWS too. It's just you'll have to go reserved instance, and if you can be the more specific you can be, you can actually get to a lower price point than GCP, but you're committing to more of this longer term, more kind of standard definition of your architecture versus in GCP you have that flexibility. So.
Okay, keep the questions coming. We've got another one here from Karthik. Karthik, thanks for watching. It's good to see you again in the chat. And Karthik's question is, how do you scale databases?
Sure. So what's interesting is that when you do what we do, where I see our goal as really identifying the traffic that your application needs to service, and then What I mean by that is that any given e-commerce site has a mixture of traffic. So significant amount of bots and scrapers in the world that put just the same stress on your site as a buying customer would put on there. And there's a lot of that activity. One of our goals is essentially to separate out the traffic that you don't need to process from the traffic that you do want to process. So there's minimize the traffic down to just what you want to work with, and then deliver as many caching layers in the system as possible. So we want your full page cache to be effective for your application, so that repeat visits to existing pages are as fast as they can be. And then we have a caching layer that sits inside our ADC or our proxy that allows us to identify anonymized requests that we can get that traffic off. And then we can layer in on top of that CDN that gets injected automatically by our proxy as well for optimization. And so how this is related to the DB question is that effectively what we're after is pulling it all, essentially getting the load on the DB down to servicing just the truly dynamic content that's required to help you make more sales. And then when we do that, what we tend to find is that scaling of the DB becomes much, much more predictable and driven by seasonality in the business versus really having this need to have massive volume. So typically when we see those like summertime spikes, we have some customers that deal in gold and silver. So they sell gold and silver online. Well, those customers, they typically scale with real world events. So if the price of gold drops substantially, you can have this massive scaling event pretty much any time of the year. But then it's not predictable in any way. And so what we're finding though is that by caching effectively throughout the system, we can get the load on the DB down to a much more predictable level. And so then even with those massive spikes, the database finding that there's a shortfall in the database becomes more of a predictable growth. So as the business grows, the database needs to be bigger. And then with a fail forward architecture, so we're basically moving forward to a read replica, we're able to handle that load change and the need for additional DB capacity in a more graceful manner. So we don't have that same kind of traffic spike that you would see that drives application clusters to need to double and grow beyond that. So
we have a question from me in the chat here, Nicholas. Nicholas, thanks for watching. Ask what I'm drinking today. And so today it is a Broekladek, I believe is how you pronounce this. It is the classic Laddie Scottish barley. It is an unpeated single malt Scotch. It is actually something that someone gave to me. So it's pretty good. It's not my favorite Scotch in the entire world, but you know, I dig it. It's alcohol. It's free. There's no complaining about free alcohol. There's no complaining about it whatsoever. It's good though. If you want to try it, it's worth giving it a shot. I don't know. I'm usually drinking something a little stronger than this, so flavor-wise. So we've got another, but again, thanks for the question. Thanks for watching. We've got another question here from Alan. Alan says, how are you handling sharing media content between instances using any network file system and you had mentioned that servers are not alive for too long. So how are you keeping the logs centralized? So how do you sync media and how are you keeping logs centralized?
Yeah, sure. So centralized logging, there's many layers of logging for us. I'll start with every request that passes through that proxy there's a lot of metadata that comes along with that. So for one thing, every request that traverses our proxy gets geolocated. So that geolocation, where that originator was coming from in the world is tagged on there. You can actually apply logic to that to say, well, if a customer's coming from China, but I don't sell or ship to China, maybe I let them browse my site, but if they go request, say, a checkout URL, I'm not going to let them check out. I'm going to instead route them to this microsite that shows them, hey, sorry, we don't sell to your country. If you are actually traveling, contact support, something like that. So there's that. So there's this tagging of metadata that occurs. Now, part of that is that that record essentially grows with all of the rules that are applied. So those web controls that I mentioned earlier, how they fire on that request, all of that information and data is captured by the proxy, and then it's brought into our control plane. And so we actually keep, for every HTTP, HTTPS request that the system processes for 30 days, it's immediately searchable directly through our control panel. So what our customers can do, us too, and we build additional, what I call kind of asynchronous services on top of this data that allow us to identify changes in performance over time, classify anomalous behavior, look for IP addresses that are doing bad things or essentially trying to do something malicious to the website. We can see that through the patterns of traffic that are caught by that service. But so that's one layer of logging, is that immediate, all of the access and how that request was handled, what server processed it, what TLS version was used in the HTTP request, where the referrer came from, how long it took to process, how long it was queued for, how long the server processed it, how we chose to handle the request, say the WAF blocked it or a web control was applied to it, that kind of thing. So all of that data is captured and is immediately searchable from within our control plane for the last 30 days. In addition to that, we also, in our hosting practice, we'll set up elk stacks for the customer too, certainly to handle log retention requirements and things like that, where we're maintaining logs for long periods of time and then snapshotting those disks and giving you whatever your log retention policy requirement is, allowing you to satisfy that with our architecture. And then I guess let me go back. I want to make sure I'm reading the question again, TJ, to make sure I didn't.
Yeah, no problem.
So those can be centralized. So on that elk stack server, they're there. We also will capture the Magento system logs, error logs on the data server as well for us. So we're pulling that to a central location that also gets snapshotted on its own disk. The question around centralization, we actually typically just use NFS for media delivery into that application server. Now, remember, that works for us because of all the caching that we're doing. So for one, the application server can cache results from that file system. And then two, the proxy is delivering cached static asset results. And then our optimization layer is rewriting the HTML to reference those static assets from CDN that we're injecting into the HTML that we deliver. So really, when you fetch a static asset, the vast majority of assets are going to actually come from CDN. And then any that miss there they'll be delivered by cache at the proxy layer. And then if you miss that, because it's a new asset, nobody's seen it before, it'll actually go back to an app server to fetch, that'll pull from NFS and then deliver it out, and it'll be cached from that point forward to facilitate delivery in the future. So.
All right. And if that didn't answer your question, I don't think we're going to be able to answer your question. I don't know. I'm not sure. But if we missed a nuance to it, please let us know. We do have another question here from Alan. Alan, is the architecture predefined, or can the client build on top of your default configuration, for example, using Varnish with custom configuration or adding New Relic?
Yes, for sure. Actually, we encourage customers to install New Relic. It helps us. So another technology I'd mention is Blackfire. Those guys have a great way to navigate the entire call stack to help our development partners diagnose performance issues in particular pages. We'll do that on a instance basis. So if the customer should say, hey, here's my New Relic license, yeah, we add that and can get that into the system, no problem. The architecture is predefined for our standard pro and enterprise customers. That being said, we do typically tailor that architecture to meet specific customer needs and requirements. So think of it more as there's this sort of, this is what you get from us, and then you have something that is a requirement, be it software or an integration point to some other, say, an ERP system or something like that, we're going to layer those in, and typically they're going to be unpriced options that are added on. Usually, if the architecture changes and it requires, say, an additional cluster of servers to provide that service, or additional infrastructure cost, yeah, then there's a cost. We'll figure that out with you. But usually, most customers are able to fit within one of those predefined buckets that really are driven by as to which bucket you fill into. It's sort of their size to volume of traffic on a monthly basis. So if you're doing millions of requests a month, millions of page views a month, you're going to be probably in the enterprise stack. There's a mid-market sort of pro stack that kind of covers probably the majority of customers. And then there's standard for the small vendor that allows us to be approachable. So you still got all our 24/7 support and everything that we do for you from a security and performance standpoint, but it allows you to live in a smaller footprint that's more approachable for smaller vendors. So, and there was a specific comment about Varnish, and we will support Varnish if it's required for performance. However, typically what we're seeing is that Redis works quite well. And that actually Redis plus the other caching layers on top, when I put all that together, I can get to the performance goals of the site without having the complexity of a Varnish layer in the stack. And then recall that we have a caching layer as well that comes from within our proxy that can key off of any of the metadata in the request that we track to decide to make a cache inclusion or delivery statement. So essentially we can identify, well, if these headers are present, it's not okay to cache this and has to go back to origin. And that if they aren't present, we can feel free to cache it. And then we can also control which parts of the site are deliverable from cache and that kind of thing. So that cache inclusion policy helps us handle everything else really.
Right. We've got another question in the chat here from Emma. Emma Hunt, thanks for watching. Thank you for your question. Emma's question is an interesting one. It's one I wouldn't have asked, so it's a good one. A lot of people don't understand the difficulty. Cloud comes with some complexities. It's just different than I'm using a shared host or I have a dedicated box. So this is mostly a Magento audience. That's usually what we're talking about here on this channel. So we'll do it in the context of Magento. Is it possible to transfer from a traditional host to a cloud host? I mean, I know the answer to that one, but I'll let you swing at that one anyway. But the more interesting question here is, what does that process look like and how does it affect my site, especially from a developer or a merchant perspective?
Yeah, sure. So the first one obviously is a yes. It is possible to transfer from traditional hosting to cloud hosting. We do it all the time. What we've done around the process is really to automate that process. So me and my team, a few years ago, we actually automated the we call it auto provisioning. That provisioning process, by automating the provisioning process, we're able to deliver reliably. So essentially we can create the system very quickly. It's consistent. It meets the goals and requirements for that customer. So what we're doing essentially is you show up with your code, your data, and a snapshot of your database. With those pieces, we're then understanding the code requirements. So what additional packages you have to have. Then we have in our provisioning, it works off a declaration. Think just a big JSON object that describes the network, the servers, what family of servers, the database, what software is required, what versions of all the software is required throughout the system. We show up with that, and then we overlay your code and data onto that, and then we provision it. And then from there, we're running a significant amount of testing. So essentially, we took the build process and squashed it down and made it automated. And then next, we're layering on a set of quality controls that allow us to check and make sure that, yeah, we provision the thing you actually purchased, that we're delivering the right software versions, everything, the site works. It it's possible to go through checkout. We can scale it. It's functioning and delivering as designed. So then once we get there, it's called web scale ready. We hand it off to the customer. The customer runs their functional testing. Hopefully they have regression testing. So they're going to test the site to make sure it's functionally working as expected. And then when they say, yeah, this is all good, and if we miss something or a new requirement's discovered in that process, no problem. We then work with you to get that requirement met. And then once you're satisfied and the site's ready to go, at that point, we enter what's called our pre-live process, where we have a bunch of alerting that gets turned on. We're tracking everything within the system, utilization of disks, how the servers are performing, et cetera. And then from there, we're going to enter that go live with you. There'll be a final database move, catch up of any media since original provisioning, and then DNS switch, and we're live. So we try to make it as painless as possible as we can. There's a lot of involvement from the merchant side for sure in terms of functional testing. We work very closely with the development partner to make sure we have all the requirements captured and that the system we build will actually meet your needs. In terms of affecting the site, what we find is that really we're delivering better performance and able to scale to higher volumes than what you could before. So that's a difference. It's delivering higher availability at a better price point, I would say, than traditional hosting. It's why folks are moving to the cloud pretty much as fast as they can. So.
All right, we have a follow-up question there on you mentioned the varnish versus Redis. So we want some clarification there.
Oh, sure.
What was meant by you get good caching with Redis and not necessarily meaning or needing varnish? I mean, they're obviously a little different. They're not necessarily direct replacements. So a little clarification there on the two caching technologies.
Yeah. So typically in our system there'll be 3 Redis services. So I'm referring specifically to the full page cache. So we'll use Redis for full page caching. We like to start there because I have to have Redis for the session cache. So we're wanting to start with Redis as the full page cache and using that sort of traditional approach there. If that delivers good performance, given the other caching layers that we're going to put in front of it from our proxy and the CDN, then at that point, it's the simplest possible thing that can work for me. If I find that, there's actually this performance problem, or for some reason Redis isn't going to work to deliver the full page cache, we can layer varnish in on top and essentially have another cluster. What I find, what I don't like about using varnish is it's adding additional complexity to the system, and I don't like that. I like to keep it a little bit simpler than that. But in some cases, if it's needed, it's needed, and we're happy to provide and support that too. So that's all I meant. And it's really just comparing which full page cache would you employ within a Magento environment. Does that make sense, Eric? Did I cover your question?
Yeah, let us know, Eric, if that is sufficient. If not, we'll keep going deeper. Keep your questions coming. You guys have got us way into the weeds. This live stream is completely useless for the uninitiated at this point. It's going to make no sense whatsoever for me to go back to my softball questions that I have prepared here. So at this point, we've got to stay in the weeds. So keep the technical questions coming. I try, once we decided to not do hosting, I try to stay out of hosting as much as humanly possible. I want absolutely nothing to do with it. I'll outsource it to other folks every single day of the week. And Eric says that...
Here comes another one.
Yeah, we've got James Daniel here, WebScale customer in the chat. James, JP, I appreciate you watching. And if you've got any questions, if you want to grill them, if you've got something, they're live now, right? They've either got to just completely deny or answer your questions. So
that's right.
Let's bring them. Let's bring them. Now's the time. We're going to live stream for about 15 more minutes here. So whatever you guys have, even if it's not related to hosting at this point, we'll answer any question you've got. I'm going to go back to my softball questions because you guys are completely out of them. But like I said, out of context, in context, this is going to make no sense whatsoever.
I get where he's coming from.
we'll get into. You get where he's coming from. You want to jump into it then? Let's keep going.
Yeah, we can. So Eric, I guess in response to your question, I guess when I'm thinking about not necessarily who's generating, I guess where I'm actually coming from is at a higher level, just treating. So when I'm using a full page cache, if I'm using Redis to provide the storage for that full page cache, in which case, PHP is processing, it's pulling blocks out of Redis, and then we're servicing the request that way. Versus, Varnish is downstream, it's out in front of the site, caching blocks, and then delivering from there. What I like to do, or rather what we prefer in our system is so what we call site cache within our proxy, it delivers that function. And so we like to use Redis as the cache block storage. And then, you're right, you're right. And we're running through the Magento application to get to that delivery. I find that when you have a cache hit to a well-designed or a well-produced system, that cache hit's going to deliver in 150 to 200 milliseconds back to the proxy layer. And then if I can cache at the proxy layer, if I can cache the HTML, because it's essentially an anonymous HTTP request or HTTPS request, what I mean by that is that it's a request that I could deliver to multiple clients on the internet without violating functionality. So I'm not delivering somebody's cart contents to somebody else, right? That kind of thing. So if, say, it's that first homepage visit, it's a bounce from somebody on the internet, they happen to do a search, they go to the site, and then they show up, they have no context, no session. They're going to hit that proxy, and the proxy is able to cache that response and deliver them a cached result in less than a millisecond. So it actually eliminates any interaction with the Magento application and just gets that request out of the system. So I hope that is a little bit more clear. It's not trying to muddle. It can get confusing with the technologies, and we kind of play fast and loose a little bit in that discussion, but I hope that clarifies it some.
If it doesn't clarify it, keep asking those questions.
I'll get another question, I know.
Yeah, I will keep pinging because, I've got no better questions than those at all whatsoever. All right, so Emma's going to take it back to basics for us. She understands the frustration of a slow site. Everyone that has chosen their hosting poorly or their developers poorly when it comes to Magento understands the frustrations of a slow site. There's obviously a lot of reasons for that, and hosting is a big part of it. So we always recommend, we run across clients that come from a variety of backgrounds and a variety of situations, and it's often that their hosting is suboptimal. We always recommend that they use a Magento specialist host if you're on the Magento platform, because it's, when there are problems, it just makes our jobs as developers a lot easier. And if they're trying to manage it on AWS themselves, or if they're using some random host that, you can't host Magento on a $5 a month plan, right? Just don't try it. Don't even, just say no, right? Just say no. Don't do that. All right, so Emma asked a question here. Emma, thank you for the questions. Do you have any stats or case studies on a site that was beautiful, well-built, well-designed site, but not hosted properly, switching to web scale, and then seeing an increase in conversions?
Yeah, so it's a couple things. So first off, I'm sure you're going to be hearing from marketing shortly with those case studies. But beyond that, the frustrations of a slow site. So typically, there's a lot of moving parts in that question that I think we'd want to pull apart. So at a high level, I would say one of the biggest challenges I think is not well understood in the community is, like, we like to think in terms of black and white. It's good or it's bad. It's not really that case, So, I mean, obviously, I'm a big believer in our technology. My team, we've hired excellent people that collectively as a team, we're both from engineering to support to our sales and marketing team. They all work and pull hard for the customer and help to deliver the best performance and availability we can offer. So there's that. So we're a big believer in ourselves. But then I think an important aspect of picking hosting, and it's one of the things that can happen when you leave it to chance, essentially you put the hosting decision off to the end, is that when you're picking your partners, you have to really look at it as partners, and that when you're steady state and you're preparing for Black Friday, all three partners have to be playing well together. So you as the merchant have to work effectively with your hosting provider, and your hosting provider has to work effectively with your developer, and that developer has to be able to hear what your concerns are and deliver for you. And that when the three work together well, you've got the recipe for success. You're going to be able to get to good performance. You're going to be able to keep that performance over time. And the reason I say keep over time is that none of these sites, we think of them as these kind of static entities. They're not. There's constant development effort. You have new feature function that you want to introduce, more products, changes to the site delivery. A big one is even replatforming, going from, obviously the community's on this mass move from Magento 1 to Magento 2, for example. Those are big decisions, and they're big changes within the site. And I would encourage you, probably the single most important thing to do is to find partners that are open to being wrong, that are willing to work with you, listen to you, understand what your pains are, and that they're willing to look at objective data. So not just what this synthetic, web page test result tells me about performance for my website, but actually be able to diagnose page load time, page performance issues across the entire customer base for a sustained period of time, track performance over time, so that when a big change or an event occurs, like a new piece of code was published into the system, be able to look at performance before and after for desktop versus mobile, and be able to understand objectively how that change is impacting the customer base and the internet. And then if you have those pieces working together, you can, regardless of where you are now, you can get on a path to getting better performance while still meeting your functional needs, and converting it from this kind of art to more a science of optimization and business decision that, that chat client, I want it on my website because that interaction helps me close more business, even though it slows down my site some. From a page load perspective, right? So you can make those good decisions because you understand how it's affecting conversions. You can actually measure how it's affecting conversions, and you can consume that with the performance data across the site and know what it's doing for you. So I'd say it more in those terms. I think one thing, as an example of WebScale, I think one thing that we at WebScale are very proud of is that every customer that comes to us, whether they stay for life or they need to leave for some reason, they're all better for having worked with us, and that we work very hard for our customers to really help get the best performance they can out of their site and get onto a path of fixing the performance issues, closing down the security holes and vulnerabilities, identifying malicious traffic and getting it out, and then really just focusing on, well, how do we make the site better today for that customer?
All right, we have a couple of questions here from Alan. Thank you, Alan, for continuing with the questions. We've got about 7 minutes left. Then we're going to live stream, and then we will wrap it up. So if you have any more questions, please post them, or these will be the end of the stream. Alan's question, and I'm going to read his question directly, but then I'm going to add a little bit to it. And his question is, first, your product sounds cool and covering a lot of things. So what if customers are not sure if they should move to WebScale? Do you have some plan for a potential client to join and test before they make the big decision? So my clarification to that would be, what type of merchant is best for WebScale? There are a lot of hosts out there. There are a lot of Magento specialist hosts. There's a handful of them that we recommend regularly depending on client needs. So, not every business out there is not the right fit for everybody. So who's the right merchant for WebScale? And then what's the easiest way for them to kind of find out more and whether or not it's right for them?
Yeah, sure. So if I start let me start there, I guess. If usually, let me sort of answer that in a different way. So we do best, and customers in our early days, we would have customers that they'd be failing, the site's crashing, they're having big problems, they've got lots of traffic, they need help because things aren't working right and they don't understand why they're not working right. And those customers were those were our initial bread and butter, certainly the ones that leveraged our auto scaling to handle these, random viral events that would occur to drive huge traffic to our site. We had early success with those. And really, it's what we're finding more and more is that it's the business that's grown to a certain point. And so they have this sustained traffic that's coming to the site. And what they're struggling with is there's usually these indicators, like they have this big email marketing list, but if they send an email blast to everybody on Monday morning, the site falls over within an hour. And so they end up staggering their email blasts. So if you find yourself separating out your emails into blocks and then sending those blocks over time, you're probably a good web scale customer. If you've grown to this point where the minutes of downtime or significant revenue loss, you're probably a good web scale customer. If you've just that sustained growth and you're panicking about how you're going to get through Black Friday this year, probably a good web scale customer as well. So it's kind of more there's a volume of traffic that indicates that you really need our services, and that once you get over that threshold, that's a likely thing. Now, the other side of that is we do have some what I'd call more B2B oriented sites that have high revenue associated with the site, but not necessarily high traffic volumes. That's where they're leveraging our 24/7 response. We do offer, I'll get to one of the other questions that showed up there, is the 24/7 365 with a 15-minute SLA on critical, and it's easy to get us at critical. We make it trivial for a customer to contact us, call us, email, Slack for the enterprise. So we make it easy to get to us. We tend to average a couple minutes in response. Often you're emailing us about something that we're already working on. If we see traffic conditions or issues within the site, we're working on those issues and then reaching out to our customers to let them know about them.
Okay, so I think we covered Eric's question there at the end. We've got a couple of questions from Alan and Eric. If we didn't give you a sufficient answer, let me know. We're going to go for a couple more minutes here. And so Alan's question was, how does the deployment system work? So I've got a Magento site. How does deployment look like? Are there any limitations, restrictions around that?
Yeah, sure. So our deployment system, first off, you identify, well, what is it the customer needs? So is it a standard pro enterprise account? What additional services are there? And those additional services are like, I need an archive server. I need additional components within the system that aren't necessarily included in Pro, so we identify all that. We create a declaration. So we're going to do some data collection from you. So if it's your cloud account, we're going to need credentials to get those, to get into that account. And then we're going to get some data from you about a recent database dump, access to the Git repo, to where we can pull the code from, and then a media dump from you. And then from there, we're going to actually go ahead and provision the system on our side. We'll create a declaration and run that declaration to generate the network, the servers within the network, configure the firewalls, configure web scale, and then get all the data and code deployed onto it. So the deployment system, so there's that, sorry, the provisioning system is what I'm talking about. Now to the deployment system. So in that, there's two ways to deploy with us. One, we call it atomic deployments. It's where you show up and we basically give you some API calls that we put into your CI/CD system, and then you're going to go ahead and be provisioning a new cluster as part of your build process, and then you'll switch to that cluster to make it live within the proxy. You do that in the control plane. You just tell it that this new cluster is the one that's routing to that. And then the other method of deployment and really you could probably switch the two. So the bigger merchants are running on that atomic deployment system. The smaller merchants tend to run where essentially they'll deploy to a location in the data server, and then we're going to synchronize those changes out to whatever the active cluster may be. In that, if you're going to do a complete dock root replacement. We don't want to work that way. We want to work in the atomic deployment section, because by doing that, we're able to minimize the amount of synchronization or the overhead for scale out. So that can work too. So there's really those two. I'd say, the takeaway there is we like to be as flexible as we can. We recognize that our development partner is extremely important in that conversation, and we're happy to adjust and meet you where you are and help you really get your CI/CD goals met and make it trivial for you to deploy into our environment. So we want to work closely with the developer to meet their needs.
All right, we've got a couple of questions left here, or a few questions left here. I want to make sure we get through that. Alan mentions that the product comes with some health check system, or I guess the question is, does the product come with a health with a health check system? Can you create alerts, if the site responds in a slow duration or something like that? Can you automatically be notified if you're the merchant on WebScale?
Yeah, so it does. So there's a number of health checks both in the product and then on the hosting side. So when you think about us, there's there's internal checks that we'll monitor and track. So for everything from system utilization to disk utilization to NFS scans to everything that really can be monitored is. And then from that, we also have health checks that are part of that. So we call them alerts in our system. So if an alert fires, we subscribe to all of those alerts. You're welcome to subscribe to those alerts in our system as well. And you can even pick and choose which alerts you want to be notified of. So the short answer is yes. They're there, and you as a merchant or the customer or the development partner can subscribe to those alerts and respond to them just as we do within the system.
Okay, Eric Hyman follows up on his question about SLAs on what is the non-critical SLA?
So one thing that we do is we like to respond to those non-critical tickets within hours. The reason that we allow for a lot of time there, we don't necessarily, we try to get back to everything as quickly as we can. But obviously, if a critical situation were to occur with a customer, that's going to take priority over any non-critical event. We're also very flexible in the definition of critical. So we look to lean on our merchant to define critical as really business critical for them. Sometimes that may be as simple as, I've got these developers waiting on my staging environment and I need this piece up and I need you guys to fix something. And so they'll send that to critical, and that's totally fine. We're happy to jump in and help and get that addressed for our merchants. Yeah.
One last question here. Karthik says, off topic completely, but I don't think this is off topic at all, Karthik. I think this is a great question, probably where we should have began all of this conversation. Magento is obviously pushing Magento Cloud. That's where they want to be. They want to be a cloud company. They've moved into the hosting game. There's a lot of other competitors out there, Nexus, Mage Mojo, that we recommend quite often. How does WebScale stack up against those, and how are you different?
Sure. I think we focus heavily on security as it's a big piece of what we do. Also, we also focus on performance and availability too. Is we almost consider that to be table stakes. The security and health of the system is something that we focus very heavily at there. So when I think that's a strong suit for us. Obviously, it's a place that we've invested heavily in managing and controlling traffic within that system. The health of the auto scaling system is really important there. So our ability to scale very quickly in response to real world events, that's a strength of ours. So those are drivers I think that would cause, if you try to look at feature function and say, well, who would I pick and why? That's a big piece there for us. It's what we tend to win on in those cases. If that's a driver for you, I think one of the things that I'm happy about this, what I love about this community is that I think all of us really care about our customers, and that really at the end of the day, when the merchants picking a partner for hosting. I would hope that they go back to that, what we talked about earlier, that the merchant is actually picking a partner that they feel strongly understands their goals and needs and is willing to do everything it takes to work with them to enable them to achieve their commerce goals. I think, so if you really take it all into consideration, obviously functionality wise, I think our breadth and depth and security, performance, and availability, plus the ability to dive into the data that we're collecting about traffic in that website, I think it's kind of that's our focus, right? And enabling us to offer additional services that leverage the depth that we have there. We're on it. That's our goal and ability there. I think for the merchant, it's really just so critical to pick a partner that is comfortable and can work well with the developer, that can work well with the merchant, that understands the goal and is able to deliver effectively for that customer.
Awesome. Looks like we've covered all of your questions. I appreciate everybody for showing up and watching this live stream. Again, we're trying to get regular. We don't have anything booked for the next 2 weeks, but hey, if you want to come on and talk about something, you let me know. Hit me up. We're open the next 2 Fridays. 3 weeks from now, though, we've got Peter Sheldon from Magento coming on to talk about Adobe Commerce Cloud. You do not want to miss that. If you've got questions about what this means for the future of Magento, be sure to join us for that live stream. I definitely appreciate all of the comments. And so with that, I think we're going to call it an afternoon. Jay, if you would, hold on just a few seconds. We'll catch up after this live stream is over. Otherwise, we're going to be putting out a lot of content over the next several weeks. We're going to try to do 30 consecutive days of content. So at least a live stream or a video every single day for the next 30 days. And we're 5 days into that right now. So I'm going to annoy you folks as much as I possibly can and put out way too much content. You're going to be asking me to stop. So if there are any questions we did not cover in this live stream, then please post them in the comments of this video. I will reach out to the WebScale team and we will get you an answer as best as we possibly can. With that, Jay, I'm going to thank you for joining the stream. I'm going to give you the final words. Where can people find out more about WebScale? Any parting shots? Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. Parting shots. So feel free to reach out to us. We're easily accessible. Webscale.com is a great resource for reading materials, case studies, the things that we do. You can get directly into contact with our sales staff that way as well. We're here to help. We understand the Magento space quite well. We've been doing this quite a while. We're very good at it. Yeah, thanks for the time. Thanks, TJ. I appreciate it. This was a fun conversation.
I do have one. I was going to give him the party shot. I do have one more thing. When we came on the live stream, he said, "Hey, you're wearing a shirt," because he had been on Kaylin Jordan's live stream, and apparently Kaylin showed up in a tank top. So to surprise people in the Magento community on a live stream, all you have to do is wear a shirt with a collar, and people are surprised. Kaylin, what's up with that, man? What's up with that? That was during Kaylin's I sit in my recliner laid back with a tank top on phase. He goes through these phases. He's a true artist. He has different phases of his career.
Guns out.
Exactly. So again, we'll see you guys in a few weeks. If we don't see you next Friday, I look forward to seeing you in the next video.